It was this day, April the 4th, 1949, NATO was founded, and at the time its very existence is, well, this time right now, being questioned by the most powerful member. And it is worth returning to where it started nearly 9 decades ago, the signing ceremony for the original 12 members, and the founding speech given by President Harry Truman.
For us, war is not inevitable. We do not believe that there are blind tides of history which sweep men one way or another. In our own time, we've seen brave men overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable and forces that seemed overwhelming. Men with courage and vision can still determine their own destiny.
Well, there has been in recent weeks a lot of rhetoric from the US administration appearing angry, frustrated by what the White House perceives as being let down by NATO members for not rushing to the support of the US against Iran, despite being asked to provide ships and support after the operation started. This was Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, a normally less hawkish member of the administration, talking to Fox News in the past few days.
If now we have reached a point where the NATO alliance means that we can't use those bases, that in fact that we can no longer use those bases to defend America's interests, then NATO is a one-way street. Then NATO is simply about us having troops in Europe to defend Europe, but when we need their help, not their help, we're not asking them to conduct airstrikes. When we need them to allow us to use their military bases, their answer is no. Then why are we in NATO? You have to ask that question. Why do we have billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars, over the years, trillions of dollars, and all these American forces stationed in the region, if we can only use, in our time of need, we're not going to be allowed to use those bases.
Let's cross to Washington, D.C. Let's bring in Kurt Volker, seasoned US diplomat, former US ambassador to NATO under the Bush administration, 2008 to 2009, and the US special envoy to Ukraine from 2017 to 2019 under the Trump administration, and the co-founder too of the American University Kyiv. Great to talk to you tonight, Kurt. Rhetoric versus reality, an insider for many decades and a knowledge of how President Trump operates. To what extent, when we hear about paper tiger, cowardly members, threats to quit the alliance, how serious should European leaders take this moment?
Well, I think you have to take it seriously because President Trump is the president and he is very frustrated with Europe, and so he may try to act on that in some way. It doesn't mean that he's justified in doing so or that the arguments that he's making make any sense, but the reality is there. I also think that European leaders should be thinking carefully about how to deal with President Trump. Simply to respond in kind, to be angry and emotional and to reject things, that's going to bring out the worst in Trump as well, and it just creates a downward spiral. I think we both have shared interests, both in the U.S. and Europe. We can work together on these. We need to take a breath and try to figure out how to do so. And I would hope both sides would do that, but I particularly hope that Europe would try to figure that out.
With that in mind, when you look around European leaders, and we hear this week a kind of change in tone, or at least a pushback to some degree by President Macron, particularly here in France, on this state visit to South Korea, saying actually on Iran, don't speak every day, maybe stop conflicting what you're saying. This is not a show, was his quote. Is that a case in point, or was that a wise move?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I mean, it's like an argument with your wife. You might actually be right, but you shouldn't just say what comes to mind. You should think about it. And in this case, as I said, I disagree with the U.S. Argumentation and logic. I think Marco Rubio in that clip was being rather disingenuous. He knows better. But that being said, we should talk about what the problem is. We have the Strait of Hormuz shut down. We have an embittered, dangerous Iranian regime in place. We both will suffer from this if it stays the way it is. So let's talk about what we can do to fix it. And I do agree with Marco Rubio. There should not have been a knee-jerk rejection of U.S. requests to use military bases in Europe, but there also should have been a request for consultations, saying we need to know where this is going, how we can contribute, what's the end game that you Americans are looking for, and is that realistic? How can we shape this? How can we participate? So that kind of dialogue has been missing, and I think that's where we really need to get to.
There's also, and I don't know how you find this, when you listen to misinformation, things you have to take with a pinch of salt, particularly when NATO's never been there for us. It's as though, and you kind of wonder how deep this is, whether it's just President Trump and the optics and being the TV president, knowing full well that NATO, the only time that Article 5 was triggered was for Afghanistan, and all NATO countries responded to that, as you know, during your administration, your time with President Bush. And to quote President Bush as well, perhaps explains the reticence of not being informed. He said, "You fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me." For many European leaders who look, particularly like President Macron of Afghanistan, Libya as well, perhaps is there an understanding, do you think, further down than President Trump from the US that, Europe has cause?
Well, I think that President Trump may have forgotten, if he ever knew, that the only time Article 5 was invoked was in response to attacks on the United States. He certainly says the opposite, whether he knows the truth or not. I think that most people in the U.S., and we're not talking as much about the administration, but the public, the Congress, Republicans and Democrats, Senate, everyone understands that NATO is an incredibly valuable and successful organization. It serves U.S. interests as well as European interests, and it would be a folly to try to break up NATO. So there's, I think, a lot of unhappiness with where the administration or where President Trump has been headed lately, but also a hope that we can get past this. And I'm very encouraged that Secretary General Rutte is coming to Washington this week, because even if it's difficult for leaders like President Macron or Chancellor Merz to have a more cooperative tone right now, Rutte can do that as the Secretary General of NATO and hopefully come up with a plan for what U.S. and allies can do together.
When you talk about how to respond, and it's nice, interesting to hear kind of advice from somebody who spent so many years as a diplomat, there's so many administrations, kind of home thoughts from abroad, really. If you were talking to European diplomats now, because there are some in some quarters that say, we've heard it from Gavin Newsom saying, "Come, when are you going to get on your knees? I should buy you shin pads." The way this is going with President Trump. So at what point, do they just say, calibrate very carefully and wait till the next administration for the sake of NATO? What would you advise?
No, I would say no. Do not wait. Be proactive. You European leaders know as well as I do, sitting here in Washington, this administration doesn't have a clear goal. They don't have a clear strategy. There's a mismatch of ends and means, where we're bombing the heck out of Iran, but it's not going to change anything. So what I would do is be proactive. I would be creative. I would try to define what a reasonable outcome would be, what it's going to take to get there, and how we could design an operation to do that. So I would be proactive as trying to find a way forward rather than reactive and negative the way things seem to be now.
Let's talk about another area you know very well. We've talked about this before, which is Ukraine. In the triage of kind of news, less is said right now, and given the kind of stalemate when it comes to peace talks, this offering from President Zelensky suggesting there should be an Easter truce seems to disappear. The strikes don't stop on Ukraine. And in the meantime, he also heard on Marco Rubio accusing President Zelensky of lying about the fact that he said territory has to be given up in the Donbass for the US assurance of security. What's your understanding right now of where things stand? And to President Zelensky's point, that has been basically explained to him as per.
Yeah, I'm afraid we don't have much time, but the Ukrainians have become decreasingly dependent on the United States. Most of the war production that they need, including drones and things, they are doing themselves. It's really mainly air defense that they still need help from outside. They have been blunting and even taking back territory, blunting Russian advances, even taking some back in what's supposed to be a Russian offensive this spring. They survived the harshest winter in years. So I think Ukraine on the battlefield is going to be okay. I think Putin's economy is very difficult, and he was moving in the direction of needing to take a pause, needing a ceasefire. Unfortunately, the war in Iran has given him more time and more money.